Wonderful. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm so grateful you all are here. I recognize some of your names and some of you may not. I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, but I'm really glad for that we can all gather here today for this webinar. So thank you so much for being here. And for those of you who don't know me, I want to introduce myself. My name is Casey. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor, art therapist, but most importantly, I'm a care coach here at Kinto. And today we're really going to talk about how to bring creativity into your caregiving, why adding meaningful activities to interacting and your loved one's day is so important, not only just for their well-being, but for yours as well. But before we do that, I kind of want to just cover some housekeeping items. So we already said welcome, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of what to expect from the webinar today for the structure. So I'm going to be kind of talking for about 45 minutes. That is the goal, fingers crossed. And then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions here at the end. And that's really my goal because I want to make sure it's also responsive to us as a group for, things that are coming up for you. And throughout the hour, the microphones and cameras will kind of stay off just for group continuity as I'm sharing the information, but we have chat available. And I saw a lot of you already using the chat, which is great. So if any questions come up throughout the presentation, please feel free to pop those in the chat. We have another care coach with us, Care Coach Jen, who is monitoring the chat. She'll be there to answer any questions if you have anything about technical difficulties or general questions, and she's also going to keep track of the questions, make sure we don't lose any in the chat so we can come back to those at the end. And, okay, so that's kind of our housekeeping there. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into it here. So I wanted, before we launch into examples of meaningful activities, I wanted to really lay a foundation for us about what makes something meaningful, more so the how and the why, or more so the why before we jump into the how, more rather. And I started with some research on, what makes something meaningful. And I think a lot of us have this concept in our mind, maybe, if something's meaningful to you, why it might be. And I was curious what the research kind of said. And for one, it talked about how if something is being created or built, if we're working together towards a goal and we're building something, whether that's small or large, that can contribute to our meaning. And with that, if we feel like we're learning something and we're becoming better at something, it gives us a sense of achievement, and which is really great for our self-esteem and our well-being. And a meaningful activity, gives us a sense of achievement a lot of the time, makes us feel like we accomplished something, which is so important for us as people, I think, to feel like we're working towards something that we find meaningful. And also, meaningful activities foster connection with those around us, as well as the broader community in which we live in. Strong relationships, as I'm sure many of us know intuitively, are really the core of a meaningful life. And what matters also in creating, kind of connecting to our environment and other people, is it gives us that feeling of belonging. We feel understood, we feel recognized, we feel affirmed for who we are. And in other words, an interaction or activity is meaningful if it reaffirms our selfhood, makes us feel seen and recognized for who we are. And we're perceived in the moment by those around us as someone who matters and is worth deeply listening to, worthy of connection. And also, lastly, the last two, also very important, is a meaningful activity makes us feel purposeful. It can give us a sense of purpose. And as we mentioned, we want to feel we're working towards a goal, and we want that goal to sometimes feel greater than ourselves. We want there to be a reason behind what we're doing, and we want that reason to be meaningful to us, and that's very individualized. But often something's meaningful if we feel like we're contributing to the greater good, or we can say, I know why I'm doing this thing. And lastly, often things are perceived as meaningful if they give us the opportunity to share our identity with others. We are, who we are matters. And if we feel like we can share that with people we care about, people in our environments, that's really important. And so, in summary, hold on. Oh, there we go. So in summary, I threw a lot of things at you there with, what makes something meaningful. But I think it's important to mention that for an activity to be meaningful, it does not mean it has to have all of those components, right? I think that that would feel really overwhelming to try to think of how do I find an activity that clicks all those boxes, right? But I think there are some key ones that I listed here that might be maybe a tad more important to be thinking about. And I think one of those is the relational aspect of meaningful activities, whether we're doing something to connect with others, connect to the broader community, and, just those immediately around us to feel kind of that feeling of belonging. And so in that way, meaningful activities are often co-created. We want to foster relationships, that feeling of I mattered, I feel seen, I feel understood. And we want to also instill that feeling of purpose and achievement and that high self-esteem and worth. And in that way, we're also getting the feeling of what I'm doing, what I'm contributing matters. And I think it's important to also note that meaningful activities don't have to be these big, grand gestures, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I think small moments add up. Small moments are what make a life, right? Small moments in continuation. And so it's the small moments that matter. So what I think, instead of maybe these big, grand gestures of, I have this whole idea of an activity I want to make meaningful, we can maybe reframe that and thinking maybe a meaningful activity doesn't have to be a big grand gesture, but it's more the intentionality behind the activity, the considerations we put in place that make the difference. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we continue to lay the foundation, because I think part of that intention is we really want to make sure we listen to our loved one, we attune to the person we're working with, we're sitting next to, or rather. And so it kind of begs this broader question: what does it really mean to listen? What does it really mean to attune to someone? How can we really tell when we're being deeply listened to? And how does that change how we interact when we feel seen, when we feel like we matter and what we say matters? And so ultimately, that deep connection can be when we feel like someone just gets us. And there's a psychologist I really like, his name is Dan Siegel, and he talks about this concept of attunement. And he says attunement at its core is more than empathy. It is an allowing of our own inner worlds to shift, to become more resonant with the inner world of another. And through that understanding, we get a sense of being felt. So it's more than just empathy. So it's deeper than that. And through attunement, we reaffirm the selfhood of others by giving them the I see you feeling. I'm coming alongside you. And I think this can be especially important when we think about how do we connect with our loved ones who are experiencing dementia, especially when someone's inner world is changing all the time. And we kind of feel like maybe their sense of reality is different than the reality we're feeling. So what can that really look like? For one, attunement really takes curiosity. We have to be interested in the why behind what our loved one is saying, what our loved one is doing. We look at the context of what's around them, what time of day it is, who's involved, and we're looking for the clues instead of immediately maybe going into solution-focused mode. And it allows us to, kind of really tune in. And this attunement is linked really with communication. Paying attention to verbal language, nonverbal language. How do we communicate with each other? What does that facial expression mean? How is their body positioned? Are they making any gestures or sounds? And we have to be aware of our own body language as well when we're attuning with someone or we're really trying to connect with them in this way. And we're trying to co-create a meaningful moment, right? So we might need to slow down, lean in, make eye contact, and truly listen to, what someone's trying to actively say to us, what they're really trying to say to us in that moment. And when it comes to dementia, as I'm sure you may already know, this can really be a challenge sometimes. And some helpful things for attunement, I think, when it comes to trying to connect with our loved ones in this way, is to reflect their statements, ask for clarification, and ultimately remember your loved one's really feeding off of your own interest and engagement. If you're trying to make a moment or an activity meaningful, you also have to be engaged yourself. Bring your own openness, bring your own creativity into the moment. Which begs the question, what's that, right? What's creativity? Gene Cohen, which some of you may know, he is a gerontologist and psychologist who really founded the idea of creative aging. And he said creativity is adding something to the world that has value. And I really love that definition of creativity because it doesn't really define what that something is. It leaves it open for us, just that it has value. And sometimes we say in the art therapy world, this idea is making special. So it's like, how can we make a moment special? How can we make a activity special? And in that way, there's value there. And, adding value to a conversation, creating a painting that didn't exist before, creatively solving a problem, all these things add value, right? And I think, firstly, also, I want to talk about creativity and meaningful activities in the sense of we often think of visual arts, theater, music, and the like, and absolutely these are creative. And they take creativity and imagination, but I want to complicate it a little bit because I know a lot of us and a lot of our loved ones don't identify as artists or musicians or, involved in the theater. And so a lot of the times we have this idea in our head, I'm not creative. But in fact, those aspects of creativity are this concept called big C creativity. But there's also what we call little c creativity. And little c creativity is creative thinking in other ways, like the creative thinking to, do a crossword puzzle, look at your fridge and all the ingredients in your fridge and say, what can I make out of that? All of those things take creativity. So we might not think of it in this big, grand, creative way, but in a way, we are all creative all the time. And we just kind of have to figure a way to tap into that. And I would also argue, and I don't know if you relate to this or not, or believe this or not, but I think it's true, that being a caregiver for someone experiencing Alzheimer's and dementia takes an immense amount of creativity all the time. Because you're trying to enter someone's world, you're trying to solve problems, you're trying to be imaginative as you try to come alongside your loved one. And in that way, that is creativity. And that's a skill you've probably developed if you didn't already have it. And that's something we can capitalize and work with there. And active creativity, again, it's done with intention. And we'll talk about more about how we can use that creative juices that are already in there with meaningful activities as well. So let's kind of go into a way to do that. So first and foremost, when we talk about making something meaningful, when we talk about creating a genuine connection with our loved ones, really attuning with them, really tapping into our own creativity. And we talked about why that's so important. But how do we really do that? And I think we all wouldn't argue that that's not important, but it kind of gets a little muddled on how I would actually do that in practice. And one way to kind of talk about this, I think, is thinking of setting the scene. We want to set up our space and the interaction for success. So has anyone really tried to talk to you and when you're in the middle of something and they just kind of interrupt and they don't really give you context and then all of a sudden they're demanding an immediate answer from you? I know this has happened to me before and I find it really kind of frustrating and a little bit distracting. Or if someone's ever come to you without giving a clear reason as to why you should do something, asking you to do it, and you don't even know how to start, and you probably don't feel really motivated or connected. And I think sometimes this can be what trying to engage our loved ones in meaningful activities can be like. We don't set the scene necessarily up for success because we kind of jump right in with, we're going to try this thing, which is very well meaning and great, but sometimes we just need a little warm up, little set the scene, right? And so we can think about the space we're in. When we want to make sure it's not super noisy, it's not super distracting. Are they in a good mood to be engaged with an activity, or do they need a little warming up, a little more personal connection before they might feel ready to jump into it? And all of that's kind of helpful to make sure the activity that you really thought out and planned goes well. That's all very important. And all of those are those attunement strategies that we talked about. And that, capitalize on those. Maybe slow down, sit alongside your loved one, hold their hand, a gentle touch to orient them to the space and get them ready to go. And also, you know, I think how do we communicate to our loved one goes right alongside with the success of a, you know, meaningful activity. And I want to talk a little bit about how do we do that and what questions we should ask. So this is the correct one. So anytime you're kind of working alongside your loved one, you're going to try to talk to them. You're going to try to build a conversation. And often, you know, that can be a little difficult. How do we do that? How do we set that up well? And I really want to talk about this concept of a beautiful question. This came to us through Dr. Ann Basting. She's a creative dementia care advocate and the founder of Time Slips, which some of you may be familiar with, which is another creative aging organization who's really passionate about how do we set up meaningful connection with our loved ones with dementia. And they created this idea of a beautiful question. And they define beautiful questions as a question that opens up a shared path of discovery. It's open-ended, there's no right or wrong answer, and they can be simple or profound ways of reframing conversations. And I really like that definition because it highlights for us the connection, but also that there's no right. And I think, especially when it comes to meaningful activities or creative activities in general, we want to do it right and we want to do it well. And I think that there's freedom in the idea that there is no right way, while sometimes that can be a little overwhelming at the same time. So I want to acknowledge that. But ultimately, creativity is exploration. And our goal as facilitators of a meaningful connection, meaningful activity, is to allow our loved ones to lead us where they want to go. And we allow us to flow alongside them. Because I say this a lot when it comes to connecting, when I've connected with anyone with dementia, or I've led art activities as an art therapist with anyone, I always say the process is more important than the product to me. So what does that means if there's connection happening, if there's engagement happening, but no art actually gets made, the real goal of the activity that I was doing was the connection and the feeling of being seen, of being acknowledged, of being attuned to. So the fact that no art happened is okay to me. So allowing the flow to happen, not getting so caught up in the idea of like, okay, we've got to do the next step. We've got to do this next thing. And I think beautiful questions are a great way to begin that flow, the creative flow, and then following your loved one. It's a really it's a great way to kind of just, again, set the tone, get the creative going. And so the process of asking a beautiful question is inviting the person into the moment with you. And this might look like, again, sitting alongside them, saying their name, grabbing their hand, saying, I have got an interesting question for you. You're, again, setting the space. You ask the question, and then you show proof of listening and echoing their responses. And I think that that's really important when thinking about engaging anyone creatively or otherwise, is we want to show that I hear you, I'm listening to you. So if someone answers saying, oh, I heard that you're really interested in the way that this is happening. And in reflecting that, you're acknowledging that. And then we also want to ask a follow-up question after that, and it can be a little bit of that yes and idea. And yes and comes to us from improv, and it's a way of building upon their response. And it validates, but it also allows for the continuation of the conversation, which is very important. There we go. So now we're ready for the slide that you probably already saw. But here are some examples of some beautiful questions. Now, again, some things I want to point out about them is they're kind of creative and a little bit abstract. The goal of a beautiful question is to lead someone in a very wonderful way. But again, they're a little bit complex. So some examples are, if love were an object, what would it be? And the kind of, I think, you know, we want to leave room for multiple interpretations, but the trouble is sometimes when we ask abstract questions, they can be a little bit confusing or tricky. So it's kind of understanding maybe where your loved one is in their abstract thinking as their caregivers, you're probably able to really tune into them and know maybe this question might be a little too abstract, or maybe they really love to talk in an abstract way. But if you kind of notice there might be a little bit of confusion happening there, you might rephrase the question to make it more successful. Say, well, okay, what object maybe would you give someone to show that you love them? It's kind of getting at the same thing, but in a maybe a little bit more of a concrete way. And it's a little bit clearer. And remember, at any moment, the reason why we're talking about beautiful questions is we're setting the scene. We're really finding a way to connect to our loved ones that fosters connection, that fosters kind of a creative spirit. And, so we want to build on that. So maybe let's stick with that question. If they say maybe that they would give flowers to someone to show that they love them, you might lean in and say, use yes and say, yes, you can give people flowers to show that you love them. That's so true. Plus, it's even better when it's their favorite flower, right? And you're tuning to them and you say, is there anyone that you gave flowers to? And so you're taking the question and you're building upon it. And you're opening up, you're encouraging them to share. And sometimes this might happen when someone responds to a beautiful question, or when we ask them to do any sort of meaningful activity. A response might be, I don't know. And I think it's important to approach those moments with curiosity and empathy to know maybe they don't know in that moment, or the question might be too confusing. And instead of saying, oh gosh, okay, well, never mind, maybe thinking of a different way that we can rephrase the question to make more sense. Or see that moment as an opportunity to maybe answer the question yourself first and allow them to respond to your answer. We can get creative again on how we approach these conversations. But in that way, you're still connecting to each other. And I really wanted to talk about beautiful questions before we launch into different types of meaningful activities, because I think the way we ask questions and the way we communicate is so foundational for every meaningful activity. Because you're probably going to be talking throughout any meaningful activity and asking questions and trying to connect. So this is kind of a foundational idea that's generalizable across whatever you kind of set up to do. And the first kind of category of a meaningful activity we'll talk about today is poetry. And so we have at this point kind of a foundation, like I said, and I wanted to kind of get into some specific examples now. And I started with poetry. And there's a quote at the top by one of my favorite poets, Robert Frost, and he says, poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. And I think that's really true because poetry allows us to access our emotions in an easier way. It makes us feel connected to the broader experience about what it means to be a human. And it's important to our brains. I found a study done by the University of Exeter in the UK that looked at scans of people's brains when they were reading poetry, and their brains responded similarly to when they were listening to music. So poetry was literally interpreted by the brain as an artistic kind of endeavor. That was different than reading an article or different than reading a book. And so it's important to us. It accesses our memories if we read our favorite poems, and it promotes self-reflection and relaxation. And I just find this incredible because poetry and really any creative writing kind of connects us to our deeper sense of self. And we won't go as deep with poetry into examples about how to add poetry into caregiving because shameless plug here. We're going to be talking about poetry and things about poetry in our workshop next week that builds upon this webinar. And in there, we're going to talk about how to actually add poetry into your day-to-day caregiving and as a meaningful activity. So tune into that for that one. So I won't go as deep into it here. But, just briefly, reading poetry out loud and having a beautiful discussion about it, using those beautiful questions, fill in the blank poetry, finish the sentence poetry prompts, all of those will go into next week as options. And the next category we'll talk about is visual arts. And as an art therapist, I'm sure you can imagine this is near and dear to my heart. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why visual art can be so beneficial to the brain. It can reduce stress and cortisol levels, and it can really get us into what's called the flow state, which is when we become so focused where an activity, it's not too challenging, we become frustrated, but it's not too easy, we become bored. It's like this perfect middle ground of engagement that allows our brains to really relax. We let go of all of these extra things we're worried about, and we're kind of in the zone. It's kind of like equivalent of being in the zone. So we want to think about when you set up any activity, we want to make it in the zone, not too challenging. It's frustrating, not too easy. We're bored. And visual arts are a great way to enter that perfect kind of flow zone. But what kind of constitutes visual art? Like, do I have to set up a painting project for my loved one? Do I have to draw with them? I don't know how to do that. There can be a lot of anxiety when it comes to visual arts. But I found a really great study, also done at the University College in London. They love the creative arts, apparently, in England. But they noted also that the brain lit up in a similar way when viewing a piece of artwork as it did as making a piece of artwork. And I think this is a really great study because it shows to engage in this way, you don't necessarily have to create an art project. You can really actively engage. What does it mean to actively engage at looking at art? You know, appreciating beauty in this way. Meaningful art engagement, it's a combination of visual arts and the beautiful questions, because to actively engage in looking at an art piece, we have to talk about it. So capitalizing on that idea of the beautiful questions. And again, in that workshop next week, we'll practice that too, how to actively look at artwork and appreciate beauty, ask questions, build on them. But here's some ideas for visual art. And I think, especially for artwork, it can be a little intimidating to start. And I want to normalize that. And I normalize that when I'm working with anyone when they're starting art for the first time. But if you say, let's do this together, and you begin sitting alongside them, and you introduce the activity as this is something we're going to try together, in comparison to maybe laying materials out on the table, explaining what to do, and either kind of walking away, or just sitting and observing, those are two very different experiences, right? I'm alongside someone, we're working together, or do this and I'll watch. And I've been in both those situations. I've been like, do this thing, and I've had someone watch me, like an art professor, and that gives me anxiety to think about I'm making artwork and someone's kind of watching me do it. It's intimidating. But if someone's next to me, we're making together, I feel so much more at ease. And it's also a moment for us to connect and talk about what we're doing. So I encourage that whenever you're thinking of a meaningful activity of how can we do it together. And also, you know, we're asking questions throughout, and also maybe leading the art process. If someone's kind of really intimidated about how to start, maybe saying, well, let's try just making a mark with this and seeing what happens. And I really like the idea of you make a mark, I'll make a mark, and we're co-creating this. I'll respond to what you're doing. We'll go back and forth. And in that way, it kind of takes a lot of pressure off. I'm also a big fan of abstract art. It doesn't have to look like anything. Remember, process over product. Always very important reminder there. But art can also be really great because it engages a lot of our senses. So we can do sensory-based activities. I've done a lot of bubble wrap printing. I've painted with flowers. I've done printing with flowers. I think art is great because it also helps us play. We should play more as adults in general, I think. With or without cognitive impairment, all of us should play a little bit more, and art can be a great way to do that. And next is nature. And I think this meaningful activity idea, engaging more with nature, may be the most intuitive one for a lot of people. Because, you know, a lot of people use nature in their own lives already to relax, calm down, connect. You know, we've probably all felt that when we've walked out in the sun, we've been surrounded by trees. But what's interesting is I found also that science backed that up. Time in nature showed that it improved memory, cognitive flexibility, attention, reduced stress, and viewing nature kind of promoted well-being, meaning and purpose. And all of those things we talked about in the beginning, all those things are so important. And nature really checks checks all those boxes. But one piece of research I found super interesting about nature is that you don't have to be in a forest or on a beach or even in a garden for some of these effects to take place. They're definitely stronger if you can physically get out in nature, but the research showed, and I thought that this was really important, that even viewing nature through photographs or through documentaries produce some of the same results. And I think this is really important when we think about our loved ones who have limited mobility, or maybe it's really confusing to think about leaving and going outside, or there might be limitations to that. Cognitively or physically. And I think it's really important to remember too, we can adapt a lot of these activities to the level of engagement of our loved ones. And so even viewing photographs of nature, watching documentaries of nature, all of those things are beneficial. So I thought that that was really, really important. And some nature ideas, I think some of those are easy to think about, of like actually just getting out in nature. But how can we make the getting out in nature even more meaningful, like add a little extra on top, is you might collect nature materials that you notice, that you appreciate, the beauty around you that you appreciate, and you can create a nature mandala, for example. So I did that with some residents when I was working in long-term care, which is the picture at the top there. We collected those. I also bought some, I bought some bouquets from Trader Joe's. So also you don't have to find all the flowers in nature. You can appreciate nature inside as well through flowers that you bring indoors, for example. The bottom image, I cut out a heart out of a piece of paper and we walked around the neighborhood and I held it up to flowers or things that I found beautiful. And it was great because it focused my attention in, and I really appreciated the small bits of nature in my environment. So that also is another fun idea. Oh, and the last kind of major topic we'll talk about today is music. And this is another intuitive one. I think for a lot of us, music is so important to us. We are connected to music through our entire lives, right? It's the cornerstone of so many of our celebrations, our important moments in life, our first dance songs at our weddings, the songs you learn to play on a musical instrument, your mom's favorite song, a song you listen to during a specific period of your life that just transports you right back to that time when you were that age or in that place. And music carries in that way both emotions and memories, and often these two are so interconnected with each other, right? And music is also one of those aspects of what it means to be human. And really, it's what stays with us even deep into the progression of dementia and Alzheimer's. And so for a lot, regardless of where kind of your loved one is in that progression, it's a great way to bring meaning into their lives throughout that time. And what's great about music is that it can really connect us without words. We don't even have to have the verbal capacity to sing along, although surprisingly often that stays a lot longer than people think. But it ignites something in us. It kind of brings us alive, and it can give us access to emotions that we might be blocking, maybe not allowing ourselves to feel. And it can even be a tool to kind of change moods. So, there were studies that showed that if you played a happy song, we can almost trick our brains into being happier. It can energize us. If we play an upbeat song, it does actually energize us. If we play a calming song, it can actually calm our nervous systems. There's power in that. And so this is so great too when we think about adding meaning into our loved one's day. What music are we playing aloud? In the morning, we can play energetic music to get us going and set the scene. And in the evening, during the wind down, or when you might be really stressed, playing that calming music might actually physically help us in that way. Music can be a tool a lot of the time. And again, music can ignite our memories. So music can be used for reminiscence. Playing a music that connects to a certain time in your life to trigger memories, to trigger beautiful conversations. In that way, it absolutely can. And sing-alongs and dancing, all of those are activities that we can access through music. The possibilities are endless with music, really. I'm a music fan, can't tell. All right. So the last thing, before I close, before we open for questions today, the last thing I want to talk about is how do we attune without words? And I thought that this was really important because for some of us, we might be thinking, these activities sound great, but where my mom or where my dad or where my wife or my husband is in the progression of the disease, I don't think they might be able to do that. Or I don't know how to approach them if maybe I can't talk to her or I can't talk to him anymore. How do we attune with each other? How do I still create meaning for them in their day? And I really think that that's a very important and very valid question. And I want to just share a story real quick about my own life where this kind of was very applicable. And then I think it could be great to open the discussion up to that as well. But when I was working in a long-term care setting, I was working in memory support as well as skilled nursing. And one thing, unfortunately, that I noticed is that many residents weren't really necessarily invited to a lot of the meaningful activities that we had in the space. Or if they were invited, they weren't really actively engaged because maybe they didn't have the capacity to verbally participate or hold a paintbrush, for example, or understand multi-step directions. And if you were in a group of 15 or 20, it was really overwhelming to try to engage in a space like that. And so I noticed often either they would kind of be, to the back, to the side, maybe present, but again, that attunement, that really deep connection that I see you, you matter, wasn't happening. And I did not like that. I refused to accept that. I refused to accept that engagement and meaningful activities were not possible for these wonderful people. So I said, okay, how do we adapt to that? How do we meet them where they're at? How do I meet this person where they're at? And this may mean that I have to let the resident lead. I have to be open to where they take me. I have to let go of my expectations about what's going to happen, what's going to be produced, where even the activity will go. And I have to understand that we're coming together again with that intention of connection and tuning in and affirmation. And that in itself is a meaningful moment. If anything gets made, if anything productive happens, that is a bonus. But that wasn't the core intention of that. So I wanted to talk about this image in particular. It was one of those moments. A woman that I worked with in skilled nursing, I'd been working with her for a while. She was mostly bedridden. She was unable to communicate verbally, but she was able to kind of give me some sounds, some occasional words. And she was able to hold a paintbrush with my kind of assistance there and really holding the paper for her. And she had some ability to lift her arms, but it wasn't a lot. But we absolutely still had the capacity to connect with each other. And we sat next to each other. There was one afternoon we sat next to each other and I introduced the watercolor activity. Again, I set the scene like we were talking about. I didn't just launch into it. I made sure we were connected first. I set the scene. We were talking a little bit. And by talking, it means I was kind of talking and looking for nonverbal engagement, looking for her to say with her eyes or her facial expression, I hear what you're saying, right? So there was attunement there as I was setting the scene. And we sat next to each other and I guided the brush to her hand since it was kind of difficult for her to reach out. And I verbally kind of walked her through step by step what we were kind of doing and what to expect. And I helped her get some paint on the brush. And I held the paper in my hands because I wanted to make it a little bit easier for her to reach it. And to my surprise, instead of painting on the paper, she painted directly on my hand. This is my hand here in the picture. And I looked up at her eyes, looked up at her face, and she was looking right at me and holding the paintbrush. And I could see like she was smiling with her eyes, like she was like, haha, like, look at that. Like she was joking with me, like she knew exactly what she was doing. And I could tell in that moment, it wasn't a mistake she missed the paper. She did that very much on purpose. And I didn't see it like a mistake. I saw, oh, we're connecting. We're in this moment, we're connecting with each other. So I actually set the paper down and I held my hand out to her, and I allowed her to continue painting on my hand. And she was using these tiny, small little strokes. And each time she was looking at me. And I didn't say, well, we have to paint on the paper. I wasn't kind of task oriented. I wasn't like, well, the painting's got to get done. Because I said, that's not really the point of what we're doing. The point of what we're doing is to connect with each other. So I don't care about the paper. I don't care that I'm going to go wash my hand and after this, I know it will be gone. I kind of really want to just slow down and listen to her. And it's interesting, after that, she also kind of took it a step further. She put down the brush and she just kind of grabbed my hand. And I wasn't really sure what she wanted, but then she lightly kind of pushed my finger down. And so then I kind of pushed my finger back at her. And then there was like this moment where we were like physically communicating without words. And in that moment, we were tuning in. And what attunement really is I see you. And in that moment, we were seeing each other. And it's this physical manifestation of attuning. And we don't need to really talk to create meaning. And I share this because sometimes I think it can really be lofty to think of our loved ones engaging in activities in this way I was describing, writing a poem, answering a beautiful question, writing creating a piece of artwork. Sometimes our loved ones, we have to understand their capacities and their limitations at this time, but also what are they still capable of? Right? We want to, all of that is very real. And I just want to say it can be difficult to think about how to add meaningful moments into activities where we're wrestling with those concepts. And sometimes it takes allowing them to take the lead. We provide the environment. We set the stage. We provide the art materials. We provide the paper. We provide the poem, the artwork we're looking at, the nature materials we bring in. But it's okay if it doesn't go according to plan, or if something special doesn't happen that day, or an idea didn't work, because that's totally normal. We can't expect success all the time. There were many, many weeks with this woman in the situation I described to you where nothing happened, or artwork didn't get made, or there wasn't this like beautiful, overwhelming kind of moment. But I still wanted to try because I knew the capacity for the meaningful connection was there and remains there. And we just have to provide the opportunity to allow that to happen. And I think at the core of it is that intentionality, and it'd be great if we could have a little fun in the process, right? So before we open it up to questions in our last kind of 10 minutes, I wanted to kind of end on this quote and really say that I think meaningful engagement, it happens in a series of small moments, tuning into each other. And we're looking for those small bits of connection, like her painting on my hand. I want to connect with you. And we're willing to put ourselves out there for the opportunity to add meaning to our loved ones' lives. And again, being a caregiver, I want to validate, it already takes so much creativity and willingness to change, to adapt. And I think all of you have the skills to lean on that creativity and really add that into activities and moments of connection between you and your loved one. And I wanted to share and end on one of my favorite quotes by this wonderfully creative and inspiring woman, Maya Angelou, who says, "You can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have." And as you begin to hopefully add some of these ideas, some of these concepts into your caregiving toolbox, I hope you find that to be true. So thank you so much for here. And I know we have about 10 minutes left. And so I want to open it up to you. We talked about so many things. We talked about, creating meaning, attunement, what is creativity anyway, different aspects of meaningful activities, different types. So I wanted to open it up for questions, if anyone has any there. And yes, I can. Okay. And I feel like, okay, Jen, are you able to?
Yes, so I think we're
Okay.
still waiting. if you can hear me. So we're still waiting. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat while we wait on that. I did have a quick question for you. I wanted to know if you could just explain to people how they can access those beautiful questions. Like, is it something that you have to pay for, or is it something they can get for free?
Oh, great question. Okay, so TimeSlips has a free membership. You don't have to become a trainer. You don't have to have any of these things. If you were to go on the TimeSlips website, and I will be we'll be sending a follow-up email too with the recording and everything. I'm gonna write that down to send that link out to TimeSlips because they have a kind of caregiver I think you would kind of call it a package where there's a few videos and you get access to some of the questions, and they have those on their website as well, which is, you know, a really great resource if you want to learn more about what the beautiful questions concept really is, and see some examples. They kind of update them too. Yeah, so yeah,
Cool.
thank you, Ben.
Yes.
Find it there.
Yeah, so I don't know if we have any other questions. We can give people another minute or oh, so we have a question from Roz. She's I'm hosting a birthday party at an art studio Saturday for my mom with an hour for art, hour for party after. How do I make sure she gets the most out of this?
Wow, what a beautiful question, Roz. Also, what a great birthday party. And
I
when it
know.
comes to that. So I think when we think about the studio, I guess like some things I would think about is setting that scene and thinking of maybe a flow of the party, maybe how you would introduce the activity and maybe open it up, and then, you know, doing it and how to maybe close it. I think like having structure can be very comforting. And I think especially when we think about doing meaningful activities or things that take creativity, and maybe even talking as you're introducing it or you're setting that scene. I don't know if is it Roz, is it kind of, and you can chat in there, if is it one of those like paint and sips where there's like they're following like an image, or is it kind of more open-ended? Either way, if it is like more of the paint and sips, I think it is still important to say it's okay if it doesn't look like the image there. Reinforce the fact that how grateful everyone is to be there, but it's okay if it doesn't look necessarily exactly like the picture. When I was working with people, a lot of the time that was kind of the biggest source of anxiety. Um,
Oh, sorry to cut you. Oh, are you reading that?
oh, I read. I'm seeing the chat. I'm seeing the chat.
Okay, perfect.
um, so the studio is owned by an art teacher who is arranging the activity. And so you want to make sure kind of that your mom is getting the most out of the meaningful activity. I think if there's someone else kind of facilitating it, there might not be then as much opportunity for you to kind of stand up and say something. So maybe if you can be next to her and really kind of doing that, like, let's do this kind of together, mom. Or you're alongside her. So if you see she needs more encouragement or is kind of getting discouraged that maybe it's not turning out exactly how she wants, or maybe she's feeling a little overwhelmed, you can kind of encourage her to take those breaks or give her that little bit of kind of comfort and connection. Because it could be overwhelming in a large group, or maybe the person facilitating might not understand dementia all the way, might give all the steps at once at the beginning and kind of expect everyone to remember all the steps. So it could be nice if you're kind of next to her and you're able, if you see she kind of gets a little stuck, or she's like, well, I don't really, what should I do next? You can kind of come in and say, oh, I think like our next thing we might be doing is, I think we have to add this part to it now. Or I'm seeing like, we might need to fill this part in with this color. Or asking her a question to say, you know, encourage her to keep going. Um, and validating and encouraging. I worked with someone who I think like part of the funny thing about being an art therapist is I find value in almost every piece of artwork everyone makes. um, So sometimes some of the people I'd be working with I would say, that's so wonderful, and I love it, and they're like, this is crap. And I've had residents say that to me. And I think like when people are really hard on themselves about their artwork in particular, or anything they make, I think it's important to remember specific aspects of it that you find interesting. And I usually would think about, well, I like the way you put these two colors together here, or this line is very interesting to me. And so they might not be the entire art piece, because that seems kind of false. Well, I love it. It's so beautiful. And people are like, is it though? I usually try to point in to a small part that I find really interesting or beautiful, and that can be really encouraging. Or I might say, what part aren't you really liking about it? Like, how can we change that up? And that might be encouraging too. But I'm excited about this birthday party, Roz. I think creative birthday parties, everyone's birthday party should have art. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yes. Rob made a comment that at least 90% of this content is useful for any relationship, and I agree. I think it's important to remember too that while our relationships with our loved ones are changing, ultimately there's still a relationship, and even us very late into the progression of the disease want basically the same things that we've always wanted: to be affirmed, to feel seen, to feel connected to. And if we can reaffirm that, um, for any human being that we're interacting with, that's important. So I love that. Right. And I wanted to say this, we'll have access to this recording. And I would love, I know for a lot of you, there are, you might be involved in Kinto already. And so if anything's coming up with, I have a meaningful activity idea I want to try, I'm not sure how to approach it, or you want to just say this really worked for me, I encourage you to reach out to either your support group chats or your coach, whether that's me or otherwise, because I think that sometimes it's helpful, just like you were doing, Roz, to like talk it out a little bit with someone, to say, okay, what is the right approach here? So I just encourage that too, if you need anybody to talk it through with. Well, is there any lingering questions, comments before we close today? All right. Well, I just really appreciate everyone being here, being so engaged, and being open to this idea. And I am really so hope that you can bring some creativity and connection into your caregiving. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night. Okay. Thank you, everybody.